Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth iteration of Dan's Data Office Hours. I am definitely getting the hang of this, so prepare to be impressed. This time around, I didn't get a huge amount of questions, and at the same time, I've had a variety of conversations and meetings with people where I talked a bit about my background, and inevitably, the topic of advertising and advertising technology came up, and I gave a walkthrough real to everyone. I spoke with how it worked, the different players, different incentives, the different trends, and I thought it would be very worthwhile to actually share a bit of that for the audience here. There's quite a lot going on, and in many ways it undergirds like the modern internet. I actually recommend a lot of people that are starting out, in software engineering, data engineering, really anything, to actually seriously consider advertised technology as a first role, just because you get a really good appreciation of how the internet actually works. So as an example, you could work as an engineer for a small app, and you have a UI, you have an app, you have a database, but that pales in comparison to working in advertising because you just have the massive scale of data. You have like real performance requirements around, in the hundreds of milliseconds for a request. And you're also dealing with the modern complexities of the web. So you have to understand the different browsers, what works in Chrome versus Firefox. You have to understand, the iframes and what you can do inside an iframe versus outside an iframe. You have to understand how cookies work. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But could you track users across websites? Why? Why not? So there's a whole lot going on there, and I think it gives you a pretty good foundation that sets you up for success no matter what you end up doing later. In many ways, actually pretty similar because I started my career and I joke it was data science before it was called data science, but I only got to really become, I would say, like a true software engineer when I did my own startup and I had to spin up my own web server, had to handle requests, had to deal with the UI and jQuery, so that ages myself a bit. And I truly believe AdTech's a good way to get that same sort of level of foundation. So without further ado, I'm going to share a bit about AdTech. And once again, this is being streamed to LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, drop comments in the chat and I'll check in on them when I can. There's about a 40 second latency lag, which is why it might take me a bit of time to get to your question. Cool, so let me, and I prepared a little bit of a diagram for this just to give the audience a sense of sort of how everything works. So first things first, this is what's called a Lumascape, and if you notice here, it's really just the display Lumascape. So which talks about display advertising. Think of ads on the website, and you can just see how I would say like robust and how complex it is. And this is just small, taking one small part of it. And I'm hoping that through this conversation, I'll be able to distill like really a lot of those sort of principle or basically the industry into like smaller chunks that are more digestible and really give you a feel for how the advertising technology industry works these days. The other advice I'll give to anyone is try to understand the incentives, and I'll spend a lot of time digging into the incentives for the different players, different parties, because if you could understand that, it makes it a lot easier to layer on the business and the technology on top of that. So if we scroll down here, I did a very, very, very simple sort of approximation of the advertising ecosystem with some examples here. So on the left, you have what's typically called, at least in advertising world, like a publisher, and you can think of it as like a website or an app or anyone that really has content that they're monetizing. Some of them will, of course, will monetize through subscriptions, but a fair amount of the open internet is still and the closed internet. So meaning Facebook is closed because they own really like the entire tech stack. Open internet would be more like the New York Times, where they're living in like a browser and they let you sort of participate in the advertising ecosystem through these third parties that we'll talk about. So there's the publisher, in this case New York Times, and they're generally making money outside of subscriptions through advertising. So if you think about what they want to do, is their incentive is how could we write compelling content that gets a lot of page views, and at the same time, how could we maximize the amount of revenue, the amount of money we're making on a per page view basis. Then to the right of them, you have what's considered like supply side platform, and an SSP for short. And the example there is Triplift, where I used to work. So you could think of what they do as aggregating all the supply. So we'll work, or like we used to work with companies like New York Times, like CNN, a lot of bloggers, writing recipe sites. And what they do is, what in essence an SSP does is it aggregates all the supply from a variety of different publishers in order to then feed it into what's right to the right, a demand side platform. And they're doing the opposite. They're aggregating the demand, meaning like advertising campaigns. To the right of those, you will have agencies. So think of them as running advertising campaigns and strategy, and even creating the ads themselves on behalf of a brand, which in this case, Coca-Cola, all the way on the right. So if you think like, why do the middle layers need to exist? Like in particular, why does the SSP and the DSP even exist in this world? Like short answer is, if you're Coca-Cola, like one, your business is in making and manufacturing Coke, figuring out the supply chain, but you also are not gonna have a relationship with every single publisher in the world, right? Maybe you will have some exclusive deals with publishers that have huge audience, and a lot of reach, and then it's sort of economically worthwhile for you to do a handshake deal with them and say, I will pay you $1 million for you to show Coca-Cola ads for the next month, right? That might be something that you do. But more often than not, you will have, you basically want to say, I just want to achieve some sort of campaign goals. I want to hit a particular audience. Let's say I want to target people between 20 and 40 in the New York State area. And in that case, you'll work with your agency and the trade and someone like the trade desk, a DSP, to load up your campaign information, saying I have $50,000 to spend. I want to show this ad. Might have, let's say, a polar bear drinking a Coke. I want to have it unique for Christmas, so I'm going to have a unique image that's designed for the holiday Christmas season, and I'm going to only show it to, let's say, people in the United States and Canada. So you would put all these parameters in to a DSP, in this case the trade desk, and then they internally would have all the technology and all the rules that would say, how could we achieve and hit sort of Coca-Cola's goals by buying inventory, basically bidding on these auctions and ad opportunities via these supply side platforms, SSPs. And in that case, the trade desk doesn't really need to have a relationship with the New York Times. Instead, they have a relationship with Triplift and a few other SSPs. And Triplift is really responsible for signing up these publishers. And the nuance there is well, why is it so hard to sign up a publisher? Why is it so hard to sign up, an agency? And the complexities there, one, commercial, right? Everyone has slightly different commercial terms. Think of some of the constraints there being, how often do you pay? If there's a disagreement around some sort of measurement and the number of auctions we're in, who finally decides sort of the total amount. And the other complexity on the technical side, there's this standard called OpenRTB, so it stands for Open Real-Time Bidding, and that really defines in JSON what are the fields that you should send when you're participating in an auction. Like, what are the properties of an ad request? And it's the usual suspects. It would have a publisher domain. It would have browser, user agent, IP address, these sorts of information. And on the flip side, you would also have standards for the bid response. So when a DSP, so in this case, trade desk, they receive an ad request, they internally will then try to evaluate it and say, are we interested in showing an ad for this particular ad request? And if so, they'll send back a brand along with the creative and the amount they're willing to pay. There's a nuance there around formats. The way you represent a video ad versus a display ad versus a native ad is very different. The way even the supply side works is different. Like, are you representing some video, some simple banner ad on the website versus, let's say, an ad inside a video clip? So there's standards for a lot of this, and there's also a ton of work being done over time, which leads to more and more versions being built out. And there's fragmentation, because if, let's say, the New York Times supports, let's say specific, New York Times is not necessarily the best example here, but some publishers will sort of have their own JSON standards, and they may be on a slightly older version of a protocol, and then you, as an SSP, need to translate it in order to work with the dozens of DSPs you're going to integrate with, and they all themselves speak a different protocol. Like, another example of a complexity here is typically when you go on the web page, you more often than not will see more than one ad. From an efficiency standpoint, it makes a lot of sense for you to say, I'm going to just send one request, and try to auction off every single ad location, ad placement on my page all at once. But some DSPs like don't support that. They'd rather you send them basically an HTTP request per ad slot. So, and then on the flip side, and on the return path, right, in this case, TripleLift or the SSP would then have to realize that, hey, these 24 responses back, we need to actually treat them as all belong to like the same page view. So there's like a lot of, I would say, like complexity there around handling, like sending out ad requests, receiving or sending out ad requests, bid requests, and then collecting bid responses and how they all sort of fit together in the ecosystem. So hopefully that gave, I would say, like a high level overview of at least like the landscape and the way the data flows. Speaking of incentives again, so we spoke about the publisher. They want to maximize the amount of page views they have and make as much money per page view as possible. So that could be showing more ads. That's one easy way of doing it. Keep adding ads, which is sort of why you see so many ads right now. But obviously the user experience sucks, which might hurt you getting a high quality audience in the first place. Then you have the SSP. And the incentive there is try to, once again, sign up as many publishers as possible, especially higher quality, and try to run and integrate with as many DSPs as possible because you really want to increase competition, right? For everyone that's downstream of the buyer, you make money if there's more competition. If you're the only bidder on an auction, it's not very useful for you. But if there's 2, 3, 4, 5, then they're all competing for the same exact ad slot, and you end up just in a much more competitive market, which benefits you as the sort of the supply owner, right? Someone that's selling something. If you think about the trade desk, their incentive is sign up as many advertisers, brands and agencies as possible, and have as much traffic running through them. Because if they have a lot of sort of money running through them, they're able to exert more control over the supply chain, right? So they could go into TripleLift and say, we have these preferred rates, or we want to be able to, give us, let's say top pick of the publishers, or do custom tech work to send us more signals that we could use in our data science models. And in this business, there's huge amounts of scale. And just by nature of how the industry works, is if you're a TripleLift or a trade desk, like any of these like large aggregators, you're often seeing requests that may not make any money on. So for example, if you think about the New York Times, they'll work with multiple SSPs, TripleLift being one of them, and that basically means that TripleLift is not going to be able to show an ad in every single auction. So we would still have to run all this work, run the auction, do the serialization, deserialization, run all the data science models, send it all to the DSP. In this case, the trade desk would do all this calculation work to try to figure out how much we want to pay for this ad, and everyone would be sending all this sort of bits and bytes back and forth, only to then result in us not winning an auction. So think of it that way, right? TripleLift had spent time or wasted compute there on doing all the calculation, all the processing for an auction that they never actually got paid for. Same with Trade Desk. So there's a big incentive to get big, because if you're able to get big, you're able to increase, generally your efficiency, right? Because you're able to win a lot more. Your data science models, just become much more intelligent, much more thoughtful. So there's a lot of, I would say, like interesting dynamics at play here. The other piece, and I could dig into a bit more of the tech considerations here. If you think about like what makes really this complicated, it's one, the sheer scale. So if you think about the amount of ads, like being shown on a given day, it's in the trillions, right? So if you're an SSP, you're basically in essence running hundreds of billion auctions, maybe trillions of auctions per day. And then each auction, each request to you ends up being fanning out to these DSPs. So one request from New York Times to TripleLift may end up being dozens or multiple dozens of requests to DSPs. And then each of them in the chain is doing quite a lot of, I would say, like computationally complex logic. So for example, running data science models that we spoke about before, being able to sort of value a particular ad request. And in that case, let's say you're Coca-Cola, you might be interested, one, like your rules may be relatively simple. You may be saying, I want to reach a particular audience. Maybe it's based on like demographic information. Maybe it's on geographic information. So those are generally simple things you do, right? Someone like the Trade Desk could then go in and say, well, this bid request has an IP address that maps to New Jersey. That's part of the audience or part of the targeting parameters. Let it through. The other ones might be more complicated. They might care about viewability. So for example, like what percentage of the time is the ad viewable? If you're an advertiser, you do not want to show an ad that's going to be like not visible to a user, because like that's just money wasted. So in that case, You also have a data science model that tries to measure viewability. And think of what the parameters to it might be. It would be the browser. It would be the location. It would be the website, and the location of the ad on the website. So using all of these, and like everyone in the ecosystem has these data science models that are really trying to predict performance across these key sort of like key attributes in order to then take that information and then feed it into your bidding model to determine how much are you willing to pay for that particular ad request. So if everything's great, you may want to be able to pay 20 CPM. So that stands for the cost per like 1,000, right? Milli, which is Latin, but it's basically saying $20 for 1,000 impressions, just like this one. And in that case, that's I would consider high quality. Like oftentimes, if some of the parameters are weak, and you may not get what you want, you may be willing to only pay, let's say, $1 for 1,000 of these, and you end up having like a lot of different like general rules of thumb of what's cheaper, what's considered cheaper inventory versus more expensive. So video, like especially high quality video where the user is fully engaged, tends to be expensive. If you're looking at mobile, that tends to often be cheaper. Safari tends to be cheaper than Chrome, and that's because we'll talk a little bit about it later. But user tracking is a lot more difficult in these sort of like these environments that block third-party cookies, meaning you can't track a user from one website to another website. So advertisers can't necessarily build sort of an idea of audiences, right? They can't really understand much about me, Dan, if they only see me across one website. But if they're able to see what I did on, let's say, New York Times, what I did on CNN, what I did on, I don't know, some car and driver, then they're able to put together a profile that's much more compelling about me, and in return, make me more valuable to advertisers. So that's the complexity, I would say, like on that side. Like we spoke a bit too around the latency is a whole other challenge here, right? This imagine that you go into a website, you want your ads, and you want that page to load quickly. Like you don't want jarring experiences by ads, refreshing, or as they render, it moves some of the rest of the content out of view. So the typical industry standard is 200 milliseconds, really, for everything to like happen, through the auction. And I mean, you could imagine how wild that is, right? 200 milliseconds, is less than a blink of an eye, and it's a fifth of a second. And that needs to mean all these network calls between the publisher and the SSP and the DSP all really need to happen like incredibly quickly. And on top of that, you have all the data science we talked about, like all the processing, all the computation. So there's a lot of engineering that goes into it. And for most, if you think about, how do you achieve this at scale, like you really lean in to try to make as many things stateless as possible. Meaning that if you could run an auction, like if you could avoid all these network requests, like you end up improving performance. So then you try to keep as much in memory as possible. But on the flip side, like some things just don't fit in memory. An example of that, and there's a technology like a database that was initially designed, primarily for AdTech called AeroSpike, and you could think of it as like a very high performance key value store. And the way we would use it, and a lot of the industry uses it, is to look up user data at auction time. So you can imagine if TripleLift would receive an ad request from, let's say, using New York Times as an example again, I would have a particular cookie ID in TripleLift system, let's say user ID 12345. We would then want to be able to say, well, we need to translate user 12345 into a separate user ID for Trade Desk that they understand, right, in their language. And for Trade Desk, it might be user ABCDE. There might be another DSP, let's say, Google has one called DV360, and in the Google's ecosystem, I might have ID, 987. And in that case, we would use something like AeroSpike. As soon as we got a request from, the website, we would then make a request to AeroSpike saying, hey, give me all these third-party user IDs where the TripleLift user ID is 12345. We would then get that back, and then we would use that information to create these very custom and unique bid requests to each DSP we would send out. And the challenge there is, there's billions of people on the internet, and if you were across multiple devices, you'll have multiple user IDs, so it quickly blows up. So we really needed a very fast, high-performance key value lookup that we would be running, hundreds of billions of times a day. Right? So like you end up, like in the advertising in particular, you do end up investing in building some of these like technologies that help advertise specific problems, just because of the scale and because of the performance requirements, that could then extend and expand into other industries. So like that's the I would say like the other big concern here. Let me like cut in. I took a few other notes like ahead of time that I want to quickly sort of reference here. Yeah, I spoke about that. Okay, the other thing here is think about ad quality and like once again going to the incentive problem. If we think back to, and let me show this chart again. So if we look back here between like the the supplier in this case and the buyer, like all the way on the right, the other thing is to look at how the money flows. And in this case, Coca-Cola has some budget that they want to spend. They want to say, agency WPP in this case, we want to spend $50,000 on this advertising campaign. These are the parameters. They'll then load up all the campaign information in the DSP, the trade desk. The targeting rules, upload the creative, the ads themselves, and set up rules around pacing. Do I want to spend this $50,000 all in one day? Probably not. So you'll say let's spend $50,000 roughly over the next 30 days. The trade desk will then receive requests, these opportunities from TripleLift, and TripleLift will in turn receive them in real time as people browse the internet. So in this case, TripleLift or the publisher will get paid, and this once again gets into like some contractual issues and depends quite a lot on the formats and the device and so forth. But one pretty common approach is the publisher, so in this case New York Times, will get paid when the ad gets rendered on the page. And it intuitively makes sense, right? Because like that is an opportunity cost for the publisher, so that by virtue of showing an ad on a particular slot, the publisher could not have shown anything else, right? They couldn't have done anything else with that screen real estate. So they get paid when the ad gets rendered. But on the flip side, you will have advertisers, in this case the trade desk, especially if it's video, may only pay TripleLift if the video starts. So like what happens there? You could submit an ad for a video, the video makes it to the page, but it never starts. And that could be because technical reasons, right? Maybe the combination of that creative, that ad with that particular browser or the JavaScript that's unique to that page causes it to not start. And in that case, TripleLift loses money, right? Because what happens is we have to pay the publisher, but we're not able to charge the the advertiser, in this case trade desk. So the world is full of these, I would say, like what's called like discrepancies or contradictions around how do you measure the right things, and how do we make sure that all our definitions across everyone in the ecosystem are consistent. So that's where a lot of the, I would say, like the real-time systems also feed into it. Because if you are TripleLift, like you want to be able to detect these failure modes as quickly as possible and stop these campaigns, these video campaigns that are not starting from ever winning on certain cohorts or groups of publishers. So there's a lot of this in there. And this leads to another topic where there's, and rightfully so, there's a decent amount of distrust in the industry because, someone like the trade desk, they don't necessarily want Triple to say, we just spent, we showed 1 million of your ads, pay us now. So each player, like for the most part, has their own third-party measurement vendors that try to provide this neutral view of like what actually happened. So for sure, they're self-reporting, and you want to, you generally want to work. You will work better, right, if everyone has high trust between one another. But companies will, like what I mentioned before, will often have these third-party neutral vendors that could act as a sort of arbiter, right? So someone like a trade desk will say, sure, we trust your numbers, but we're also going to add some unique JavaScript to every time we show an ad, and that's going to send a request back to some of our partners, and they'll help us measure what actually happened on the website. So TripleLift, you might say that the ad was 80% in view, but our vendor will show that it's 60% in view. Great, right? So like there's cases like that that I would say like add like a whole other level of complexity here. And let's see, something else that I want to talk about. Yeah, I think that's generally it from like the technical side of things. The other thing I'd want to highlight is, I mean, we only have like 5 minutes left, but some of the trends that are currently happening, sort of to keep in mind and seeing, what will happen sort of to the industry going forward. So one is this idea of like a publisher as an advertiser. So, and maybe one way of thinking of it there is if you are, I don't know, like the New York Times, like you also have ads across, a whole other suite of websites because you want to drive traffic there. So there's some level of some publisher doing like arbitrage, or realizing, hey, we can monetize users much more in our content. Let us get cheaper users elsewhere. That leads to the next topic, also like retail media networks, which is like huge these days. If you think of like, I mean, some people will say like Amazon pioneered it, but they're definitely one of the most dominant there. But when you go to Amazon, you're there to make a purchase, right? It's an e-commerce website, and you have a particular product in mind, so you'll search for something. But what Amazon does is they'll also show ads for maybe that product, but maybe some competing products. And in that case, it's the merchant that pays Amazon to show that ad, right? So think of Amazon's business model there. They're both making money in order to support the e-commerce use cases and by holding inventory, by taking a cut of the profits, but they also make a much higher margin business doing advertising. I think the last, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think they were like doing about $40 billion, like last year. Like that's massive, right? Just purely on just advertising, showing ads on Amazon.com, and obviously they're now trying to expand to the open internet, right? And one of their merchants may say, I want to show an ad whenever someone searches cup, but then could then say, well, we showed, Dan, a picture of a mug when they were searching for mug, but we could also show them ads across, other websites as they browse the internet. And you see this happening a lot in, something like Instacart as well, right? They're, service that relies on workers going in to do shopping at, let's say, real retail, grocery stores for you. And if you're a grocery store, or Instacart in that case, you could say, sure, we'll make money by taking a cut of each sale and paying our workers, having people go in and do the shopping for you. But they'll also recently, or not even that recently, start showing ads, in the Instacart app. So if I search for coffee, I'll see different advertisers bidding to show me an ad for their particular brand of coffee. Once again, like for Instacart, that's free margin, right? It's like much higher margin than trying to actually, pay, for the physical world. So there's this massive trend of sort of leading this role of, if you're a retailer, you want to have proprietary data, and two, you have an audience, and relative to your existing business, running advertising on top of it is just like free money. So there's a huge uptick there. I mean, even beyond that, it's not necessarily retail media, but Uber, like Uber, you open the app to book a car, order some Uber Eats, and once again they show ads. Like there's not necessarily for a transaction, but it's just an ad for like some particular brand. Once again, for Uber, it's free money, and if they have enough eyeballs, right, enough sort of page views, like they're able to monetize it. The other big thing, major one, is cookie deprecation. We hinted a bit earlier, but Chrome, so Safari's been like this for a while, like maybe forever, but they don't let you set third-party cookies. So what that means is, if I'm on a website, let's say website.com, the only person or the only entity that could set a cookie on my browser has to have the website.com in the domain. That means anyone that's loaded, some JavaScript that gets loaded on the page from a third party, let's say googleanalytics.com or .google.com, like they cannot set a cookie just by virtue of me being, because I'm on like a website that has a different top level domain, right, in the browser address bar. But you're able to do that in Chrome. So if I'm on website.com and there's a Google Analytics JavaScript running on the page, Google is then able to set a cookie for me. So you can imagine how that becomes incredibly powerful, because then advertisers and basically a lot of the players in this advertising marketing ecosystem are able to build profiles across users, because they're they see you behavior across dozens, hundreds of websites versus hundreds individual, versus with first-party cookies, in essence, what you're seeing is the opposite of that effect. You see, hey, this is 100 different people across, each one only going to a single website. So the trend now is, as Chrome made a plan and they keep postponing it, saying we're going to get rid of these third-party cookies in Chrome, which is still dominant browser, and everyone's trying to figure out, what is our take here? How do we, sort of get beyond this? How do we succeed, like in this world, despite like these cookies? And I think the general sense is like advertising will go on, but like what happens then? So I think one theme is contextual advertising becomes much more important, meaning you look at the content of the website. Are they reading about cars? Like in the past, if you're reading about cars, you could still show an ad, from let's say a product or a merchant that you saw, in another browsing session. Like now people are saying, well, now you can only show, use that as the fact that they're interested in reading about cars means that they're interested in cars, right? So more contextual, which leads to a whole other element of, if advertisers or a lot of companies are trying to get bigger and close the loop, right? Being able to track users from the time they saw an ad to the time they made a purchase in order to sort of justify their existence, improve their models, and so forth. Yeah, and probably the last thing to cover in 1 minute is the role of AI and what's going to happen there. And I don't know, like I think it's sort of anyone's game here. One view, or you could have like two very different views. One view is every publisher starts using AI to generate content, and then content itself becomes commoditized. And then the flip side is like, do users even care? Because if as a consumer, maybe my entire experience becomes search, right? I'll go to like Perplexity.ai or even like Google. Instead of Google search linking me off to a website, maybe they'll answer my request then and there in the Google. And like I don't know, it's interesting to see how it all plays out. But I would follow the incentives and sort of keep an eye to see what it happens there. I'm gonna do a quick check on the LinkedIn comment section to see if anyone left anything, but no. Okay, so cool. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.